Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention. I'm Mike Swetnam, and I'm the CEO of the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, and it's my great honor to welcome you to the 18th Annual Review of Terrorism events, opportunities to deal with it, and concepts and studies for how to prevent it from ever happening again. For the last 18 years, the Potomac Institute has been the very proud home of the International Center for Terrorism Studies that has been headed by Professor Yonah Alexander. I'm sure all of you are here because you know about Yonah and the tremendous work that he has done. We think of his center at the Potomac Institute as the foremost academic center for the study of terrorism in the world. It is affiliated literally with dozens of universities and think tanks around the world and publishes dozens of articles, seminar findings, and books every year on almost every aspect of terrorism, how it is being carried out around the world in every part of the world, how different parts of the world are dealing with it, and how academics, statesmen, and scholars can come together to offer up ways to deal with it and to deal with the underlying causes of terrorism. This past year, Yonah has helped initiate a number of books that on the issue, from the Islamic State, which is just recently out, to a book on NATO terrorism, to the consolidated writings of Osama bin Laden. All of these are available from our website and also on Amazon and Lexington Press, and we'll be very happy to direct you to them or to the many publications that the Institute and that the Center have published this last year on terrorism events around the world and what can be done to deal with them. I'd like to report to you in summary that after 18 years of looking at the issue at the Potomac Institute, that things are improving. I think if I'm going to put a happy face on it, I can say that those focusing on the issue, the academic study of it, the political focus of it around the world is increasing mightily and with great purpose. Unfortunately, the threat is still there, growing, metastasizing, and evolving in ways that threaten more people than ever before. Unfortunately, this is something that most likely our grandchildren will deal with. It is up to us to give them as many tools as they can. I'd like to ask you all to join me, however, at this moment in recognizing Professor Yonah Alexander. His contributions to not just academia, but to the world are something we should all applaud and encourage and hope that it continues for the foreseeable future. Professor Yonah Alexander. We brought together today, Yonah has brought together today, a very experienced and senior panel to discuss these issues. We have a keynote speaker who is currently serving as the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and I'd like to introduce General Al Gray, the 29th Commandant of the Marine Corps, chairman of the Potomac Institute Board of Regents, and before he gets here, because he's going to kick me off the stage, I know, the Grayisms, published this last year by the Potomac Institute, which documents all of the things General Gray has said. General Gray.
Haven't you finished? I want to add my welcome to all of you, and we're particularly honored this afternoon to have a very distinguished general officer speak to us in his keynote address. General Vincent Stewart is a great leader. He's been and is a great Marine, and I'm very honored, really, to have a chance to tell you a little bit about him. His biography is in your notes here, so I won't go through all that, but I do want to mention that General Stewart not only has had and held all of the key command assignments in the signal intelligence arena in the Marine Corps, in the combat intelligence arena in the Marine Corps, and has served also in staff and command positions everywhere from the Department of Defense, the 4th Marine Amphibious, you name it, he's done it. He's also a distinguished communications officer. He's an armor officer by original trade. He's been to many, many schools. In fact, 8 different military schools, and 5 of them were on my watch. So that's my fault for sending him to too many schools. But I say this because I think it's crucial that the intelligence community be infiltrated with a goodly number of non-intelligence people, operational people, people who have operational experience, so that you can do not just the intelligence analysis, but the operational analysis, the data analysis, etc., from that standpoint. Some of our greatest intelligence victories in all through our history were created really because you had operations and intelligence operating together and working together and thinking together. And so I'm very proud of you, Vin, and without further ado, I'll turn things over to you. You can take as long as you want.
Thank you. General Gray promised that he was going to do a very short introduction. He has never called me distinguished, so that's a first, so thank you, sir. I'm going to try to do a couple of things today. Thing one is I'm going to try to talk a little bit about this terrorism topic. Then I want to touch a little bit about what we at DIA think we're doing to help to counter terrorism. So first of all, it is truly an honor to be here, to sit next to Governor Ridge and on the podium with Senator Lieberman, our distinguished public servants, is truly an honor for me. And so thank you all for inviting me to this event. Combating terrorism is unmistakably an important topic on everyone's mind. Today's agenda constitutes a significant opportunity for sharing and debating ideas, defining the threat, as well as to identify opportunities to undermine forces that use terror. I emphasize defining the threat for this reason. I've heard, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in detail, I've heard that it is all of Islam through thugs and criminals. And until we settle upon which of these, which ends, or somewhere in the middle that we're dealing with, we probably won't be able to define a coherent strategy. So we'll talk about that a little bit. I'll also, as I mentioned, take the opportunity to highlight some of the things that DIA is doing. Terrorism, ladies and gentlemen, is not only a grave threat to international security, it's a direct assault on humanity. During our lifetime, we've witnessed individual acts of ideologically, politically motivated terrorism transform into a continuum of sheer barbarism, covering vast areas and territory, and shrouded in religious symbolism. Although terrorism is not new, it is a reality with increasing intensity, especially since the time I put on a uniform in the early 1980s. From Hamas to Hezbollah to Al-Qaeda, and now the self-proclaimed Islamic State, terror is used as a violent tool to advance criminal and politically intimidating strategies. The recent Paris, Beirut, San Bernardino, Mali, Jakarta attacks demonstrate that Daesh, ISIL, ISIS, or whatever you'd like to call them, has now become a direct terrorist threat around the world, especially in Europe and here in America. More information is coming out about Daesh operatives allegedly here on U.S. soil. So these recent attacks may be just the beginning of violence perpetrated by Daesh, by their inspired lone wolf actors, by returning foreign fighters, or Daesh-coordinated and directed attacks. In Daesh, we see what our analysts call a proto-state. We are simultaneously confronting both a quasi-military force with state-like features and transnational terrorist organization driven by religious ideology. Like a state, it claims territory, attempts to control its borders. It has an executive, a command and control structure, a set of laws, a taxation system. It builds an army and supposedly provides services as well. While not recognized as a state by modern nation-state standard, it has been recognized by affiliates around the world who've accepted Daesh's goals of a global caliphate. Daesh has advanced this notion by marrying its technological capabilities with ideological incitement to transform cyberspace into another dimension of this battle space, one with immediate effects on non-traditional battlefields marked by terrorist attacks all over the world. The idea that the caliphate exists, both in physical and virtual domain, is Daesh's center of gravity. To highlight, last year Daesh remained entrenched on Iraqi and Syrian battlefields and expanded globally to Libya, Sinai, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Algeria, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and the Caucasus. It even inspired terrorist attacks in Beirut, approximately the same time frame as the Paris attacks. This year, Daesh is growing more dangerous through emergent branches in Mali, Tunisia, Somalia, Bangladesh, and Indonesia, and it wouldn't surprise me to see them extend further into Egypt. Daesh is likely to increase the pace and lethality of its transnational attacks because it seeks to unleash violent actions and to provoke a harsh reaction from the West, thereby feeding its distorted narrative. We know that Daesh does not represent Islam or the 1.5 billion Muslims around the world, and yet Daesh claims to be creating by force a caliphate, the true caliphate, a notion that is resonating among a very select segments of the Sunni community who advocate violent Salafi jihadism. It is important to note that it takes all three of these words together to describe the current threat environment. In this setting, Daesh seeks not only to pit West and Islam, but to stoke sectarian conflict between Sunni and Shia, not so different from the violence of Shia jihadist groups such as Hezbollah. These groups seek to create a chaotic environment in which the groups can thrive. These threats are exacerbated by the security challenges of the Middle East, which is now facing one of the most dangerous and unpredictable periods in the last decade. Middle East countries face simultaneous internal and external threats, including terrorism, subnational armed groups or insurgencies, and conventional military threats. Some nations have even attempted to eliminate their political or sectarian adversaries under the guise of combating terrorism. While Daesh might be at the forefront of our thoughts today, they're not the only nefarious organizations in town. Increased international focus on Daesh allows al-Qaeda to recover from its degraded state, and it enables similar groups to flourish. We must not forget al-Qaeda and its affiliates still exist. We cannot count them out. Al-Qaeda along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, Jamaat al-Nusra in Syria. While they may not have advanced their goals in the mindset of a caliphate, similar ideology and analogous tools of terror drive them. Furthermore, the jury is still out on the largest state sponsor of terrorism, Iran and its affiliates. We do not yet know if Iran will behave responsibly or how they will invest the $100 billion they received as a result of the Joint Comprehensive Agreement. Let's not forget that since January 19th, 1984, Iran has been listed as a state sponsor of terrorism. We will not take our eyes off of these threats. We also face uncertainty in South Asia. The Taliban has launched its first ever winter offensive in order to make a comeback in Afghanistan, and it has increased attacks in Pakistan. Daesh is also attempting to expand their enterprise into South and Central Asia, as well as Southeast Asia. Drawing your attention to Africa, I see a volatile security environment due to dysfunctional political systems and conflicts, creating permissive environment for transnational terrorism. In North Africa, years of civil conflict over political control of Libya and an expanding violent Salafist jihadist presence remain the most pressing security concern. Even there, Daesh has established a stronghold in Sirte, Libya, causing instability and increasing illicit activities, as well as increasing activities in Algeria. West Africa's Sahel and Lake Chad regions are also contended with a number of violent Salafist jihadist groups. The recent terrorist attacks in Burkina Faso and a November 2015 attack on a major hotel in Mali highlights the expanded terrorism threat. In Nigeria and the greater Lake Chad region, terror attacks by Boko Haram, also known as the Islamic State West African province, who are the most violent Daesh affiliate, which is saying a great deal, and are likely to continue, especially since their alliance with Daesh. Parts of Central and Eastern Africa remains at risk of instability over the next year. Al-Shabaab attacks and control of rural areas will persist in Somalia. The risk of episodic violence in the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, South Sudan, and Sudan will continue despite peace and stability efforts. The key causes of instability: aging authoritarian leaders, lack of political transparency, corruption, suffocated civil societies, violation of human rights, religious extremism, insufficient economic opportunity, and sparse social mobility are some among many. And they will continue to serve as drivers for civil conflict, social cleavages, instability, spillover, and regional spoilers involvement. All of these issues Daesh plays upon and blames the West for its challenges. These terrorist threats and the drivers of conflict alone, not taking into account the myriad other global security concerns, state actors, the economy, and technology, have profound impact on the way DIA shapes and sizes its force to deal with the future. Our mission: simply provide intelligence on foreign military capabilities and operating environment that delivers decisive advantage to prevent and decisively win wars. We're one of 3 all-source intelligence agencies that effectively incorporates operations analysis as well as science and technology to support our mission. We face a complex security environment marked by a broad spectrum of disparate threats, from aggressive nation states to adaptive non-state actors. Many of these threats bridge more than one of the warfighting domains and spans across multiple categories in multiple regions. All of these have implications for future joint, interagency, multinational, and public partnership at all levels, especially how military power will be used, especially to counter terrorism in the gray zones. Whether we're talking about the mountains of Afghanistan or throughout cyberspace. In addition, while these efforts continue in the military realm, military action alone is not sufficient. Diplomacy through collaboration is also a significant force multiplier. Therefore, we must think about how we do business. We have to take a broader approach to partnerships. Collaboration across the services and the whole of government is no longer enough. Fully integrated partnership with our key allied nations is now an imperative. Our relationship with our allies, our military responses, and the way that we practice intelligence must therefore adapt and posture for the future. We must be prepared to operate with greater speed, flexibility, jointness, partnership, and accuracy. The way to do this is through integration, not as an end state, but as a means to an end. To address this challenge, DIA and our intel partners have moved towards integrated intelligence centers, sitting analysts next to collectors, collectors next to collection managers, next to engineers, technologists, mission support experts, all in close contact with the full array of intelligence collection capability. This operating model reflects the success we experienced on the battlefields in Afghanistan and Iraq. It best suits our future challenges because it empowers center leaders to effectively manage the entire intelligence cycle from end to end, maximizing efficiency and effectiveness. This creates a cohesive, collaborative operating model that can truly deliver decision advantage. One such example is our Defense Combating Terrorism Center, our functionally focused center. DCTC, as it's called, works in unison with the National Counterterrorism Center and our 4 deployed military forces, especially the Special Operations Forces. Our DCTC integrates critical defense analysis, target, and collection to enable warning, operational decisions, precise action within the warfighters' operating environment against terrorists and their networks. We maintain a broad set of capabilities that aid personnel recovery, exploit captured materials, and build identity intelligence. We've also integrated our foreign partners because in today's complex security environment, we cannot understand the world without them. When it comes to our Five Eyes partners and other key international partners, it is unlikely that we'll go to war again without them. We will be in combat as a coalition. So why shouldn't we fight and integrate as a coalition today? Almost 2 years ago, in March of 2014, DIA stood up our Five Eyes Center, tasked with integrating DIA and Commonwealth capabilities to the maximum extent possible. The Five Eyes Center advocates improvements to warning, collection, analysis, crisis planning, operations, and information technology. I'd like to think that DIA is on the forefront of international intelligence integration. The more we can expand Five Eyes and other key partners' integration across our agencies, the more we can advance effective policies and operations. Our goal is to take DIA from a Five Eyes enclave to an agency that thinks and acts as a Five Eyes agency. We're also taking unprecedented steps in intelligence sharing beyond the Five Eye community. Take, for example, our collaboration with France, our oldest ally. We've maintained a close partnership with France, not just recently in the result of the Paris attacks, but before encountering terrorism around the world, whether in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, or North Africa. We also maintain many bilateral intelligence sharing and other relationships with other partners throughout the world. Partnerships with majority Muslim countries are vital to gain a holistic understanding and to foster regional capabilities. Integration, innovation, modernization give us an edge given the multitude of challenges that we face ahead. In closing, let me go back to the topic at hand and take a moment to share with you. You'll probably hear this again if you haven't heard it before. On 2 December this past year, in the British House of Commons, Shadow Foreign Secretary Sir Hilary Benn spoke of his support in action against Daesh. While he explained that Daesh poses a clear and present threat, what struck me was his description of the enemy. And he said, and I quote, "And we are here faced by fascists, not just their calculated brutality, but their belief that they're superior to every single one of us in this chamber tonight. And all of the people that we represent. They hold our belief in tolerance and decency in contempt. They hold our democracy in contempt. And what we know about fascists is they need to be defeated. The caliphate must be destroyed. This movement must be defeated." This is definitely something to think about, debate, and come to a better understanding, especially during the following panel of distinguished experts and statesmen. Thank you for enduring me this afternoon, and I'm prepared, I think, to answer your questions. Sir, Norm, how are you? Norm used to be one of my instructors at one of the many schools. The reason I went to a lot of schools is because I couldn't learn that quickly, so I had to keep going back for more.
Well, you've done very well.
Norm.
I have a question. Could you give us an assessment of Iran as a de facto co-belligerent in this effort, the limitations, the problems that that presents, and the challenges that that presents?
Yeah.
If you could.
The underlying conflict that's running across the Middle East is the Saudi-Iran conflict. And they're at complete odds in terms of their end state, which makes getting after Daesh, particularly in Iraq and Syria, very difficult. The focus of effort should be on Daesh, yet for the Iranians, the focus of effort is the Assad regime. So I always remind folks that we saw this kind of terrorism that goes back to 1979 with the the Iranian Revolution. So they play a difficult role on the battlefield because they are the one state who continues to use or advocate state-sponsored terrorism to the IRGC, the Quds Force, through Lebanese Hezbollah. And so they do, in fact, complicate actions across the region. Complicates action in terms of our partnerships, complicates actions in terms of how we target on the battlefield, and they're not terribly helpful. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm trying to not stir up too much trouble with my answer. Sir.
I'm wondering if you
I generally stay away from the press, so I don't understand why I'm here at the National Press Club. But
you're at the National Press Club in an open forum,
in an
so
open
I'm taking
forum.
advantage.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's anything you can share with us about the
No.
Well, I'm going to ask anyway
Okay,
about the
right.
North Korean missile launch the other day and what you might be able to tell us about that launch and whether or not it successfully put an object or a satellite into orbit.
So I can tell you that they conducted a space launch that looks to many of us like the characteristics that you would want to have for an international, intercontinental missile. I think it's fair to say that the launch achieved its orbit. And I think I may stop there. It did achieve its orbit. It did have a payload, and I think I'm probably safer to stop right there.
There is open source reporting about 2 objects being tracked.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that? Are there 2 objects being tracked?
I don't know that it would be a good thing for me to talk about what we can track and how we track them.
In the open right now.
Right. Well, yeah. The fact that it's in the open doesn't mean that I should confirm it now, does it?
Okay.
Because
I'm only trying.
Confirming something because it's in the open is probably going to get me in trouble. So I'm not going there. Nice try, though.
Thank you, sir.
I think I probably told you more than I really should have.
Sure about that.
Yeah. I'm very, very careful, sir.
I'm Shamim Ahmed from Bangladesh Embassy. Thank you for your keynote speech. I just disagree with observation that IS also has spread to Bangladesh in South Asia. Our government position is that already declared zero tolerance against any form of extremism. And in fact, there is no presence so far of IS in the Bangladesh soil. We have very effective and meaningful cooperation with the U.S. government and others in countering terrorism. So I'll be happy if you...
There are, if I could.
Yeah, but so far there is no presence of IS elements in Bangladesh. Thank you, sir.
So Daesh, in their own publication, The Beak, offers 5 characteristics for someone to join, be an affiliate of Daesh. Declaration of allegiance to Abu Dua, unity and nominate a leader, develop a strategy to implement Islamic law, establish contact with the ISIL leadership, and gain ISIL leadership support. Whether there is to find the scope of it, elements within Bangladesh are on their way now to meeting all 5 criteria that Daesh has published in their own open publication, The Beak.
There may be 1 or 2 radical outfits, they are sympathizers for IS, but as such, there is no IS presence, and the government has successfully contained the homegrown militant outfits. So at present, the country is free of any extremist radical Islamic groups.
Okay, if it's okay, I probably won't take them off my list just yet. I'll just kind of watch that. I take your word for it, but I probably won't take them off the list just yet. Sir.
Yes, so until this past May, I was a program manager at the DARPA, where I ran probably the largest research program in social media research in the United States government to date, on the order of about $50 million. And I was not able to get anybody in the United States government, more or less, interested in using any of this fantastic technology. that we developed. And the reality is that Daesh and the Chinese and the Russians and everybody else in the information space has basically up to this point gone completely unchallenged. I don't see that changing anytime soon. I wonder if you have any ideas or ways to go forward on this and to change that.
The only idea I would offer is that those adversaries who cannot meet us and confront us and be effective using conventional military capabilities will augment their capabilities by trying to win the warfare in the information space. And so that space must be countered. Now, my agency will not do that. I think it's important. They're starting to do some things now in a number of other agencies that will counter the narrative and confront Daesh in the information space. But I think warfare in the information age requires that we find the tools and the approaches and the techniques to counter narratives and present a more compelling narrative, our narrative, to our adversary. And that's as close as I can get to giving you an answer that I agree with you, but I probably don't drive this conversation.
Well, I would suggest, just for the record, that the tools now exist.
Yes.
It's only a question of having the will to use them. I mean, our adversaries are using them spectacularly well.
Yes.
And we are not.
And I cannot disagree with you.
One more.
Sir.
General, thanks very much. I'm Mike Kraft, a counterterrorism writer. You mentioned intelligence integration of intelligence information. Yeah. Could you talk a bit about the challenges of timely intelligence in attacking ISIS? For example, there's been some criticism that the U.S. bombing operations are not vigorous enough, and some people claim because they're being super cautious. Can you discuss the difficulties or describe it in getting good information, and also confirming, targeting?
Yeah. I did an experiment many years ago where we tried to find small, fleeting targets in a large desert environment, 29 Palms, California. That is particularly difficult because they're not massing. In spite of the images that you see, they're not massing their movements. Finding targets, though, that gets after the critical vulnerabilities, we're starting to pick up the pace on that. I think you may read, if you haven't already, some attacks that we've done on some of their cash flows. We're going after the oil infrastructure. We have a pretty high threshold to protect against civilian casualties, and I'm comfortable with that space because it separates us from other nation states who are not as careful in how they employ weapon systems. So I think we're seeing an increased effort to understand the systems that make up this proto-state, and I think you'll see increased precision targeting of those critical vulnerabilities, but we will also err on the side of limiting our casualties to civilians.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Moving on with the rest of our program, just a few hours ago, the President of the United States announced a $1.8 billion program to deal with the Zika virus, which is a relatively innocuous, can be deadly, can cause problems virus that's moving up from South America, but hasn't resulted in any widespread casualties or problems in the United States except for fear. Few things cause fear and have the potential to terrorize us than biological events. And the use by terrorists of this technology frightens us all. Last year, a little before last year, into last year, a blue ribbon study panel was empowered to look at bioterrorism and inform Washington, D.C., the Congress, and the President on these threats. We have with us today the two chairmen of that bioterrorism study panel, as they just released the first report from the panel with recommendations on how to deal with one of the most frightening terror scenarios that can ever be brought together. The two chairmen I'm speaking of are two of the most distinguished bipartisan public officials that Washington has seen in the last century. Both of them have served on national security issues for many decades, and we're privileged to have them in our country. We're privileged to have them here today to talk to us about this. And I'd like to first introduce Governor Ridge, and then later Senator Joe Lieberman, co-chairman of this panel. But let's start with Governor Ridge, who served as governor for quite a long time, and then the first Secretary of Homeland Security, and has spent the last couple decades dealing with the issues of terrorism, national security, and most recently, biodefense. Governor Ridge.
Thank you, Michael, for that very kind introduction. Thank you for your warm reception. We're glad you're here. And thank you for taking the time. I do want to say to you, Michael, the Blue Ribbon Study Panel is grateful for the Institute's strong participation. We relied heavily on Professor Alexander throughout that year and a half. On behalf of all our panel members and all those who participated, we're grateful, and we hope we can continue to maintain that relationship as we go forward. So, you know, ladies and gentlemen, Senator Lieberman and I were asked to co-chair the panel, but one of the preconditions to accepting both the opportunity and the responsibility was that we didn't want to write just one more Washington report. We insisted that we also, upon the conclusion of the effort and the writing of the report, that we make very specific short and long-term recommendations to the Congress of the United States. We felt that strongly about it. So I'm grateful to be here with my friend Senator Lieberman, and we look forward to, both he and I and the panel look forward to working with the Institute as we take these recommendations and hopefully convince the Congress of the United States that how serious it is. You know, I don't know how many of you figured that when you showed up today, you'd have this great briefing from General Stewart about perhaps the kinetic threat of terrorism, and we all know there's a digital threat, as you pointed out. They live in the digital world and in the physical world, but there's another world of concern that we addressed in the panel, and that's the world of bioterrorism. It is one of the lesser discussed aspects of the terrorist threat. But after a year of inquiry, not just in Washington, D.C., but around the United States, we concluded that the threat is real, it's growing, and frankly, given the nature of the threat, we don't think that the country is sufficiently prepared for it. And one of the interesting challenges that, and to try to framing this for the body politic and for Congress, frankly, whether the threat, the pathogen is thrown at you by Mother Nature or a terrorist group, the impact and the consequences are the same. So to a certain extent, it was a dual-use panel. Whether you're dealing with the Zika virus or you're dealing with a bioattack from a terrorism, we're still not adequately prepared regardless of the source of the attack. And Mother Nature reminds us regularly the global need to combat contagious pathogens regardless of the origin, regardless of the source. Nature is already forcing us to deal with a great many infectious diseases. We all witnessed the events of the last 2 years as Ebola ravaged 3 countries in Western Africa and crossed continents to reach Europe and the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, shortly after I accepted the opportunity to work with President Bush as Assistant to the President for Homeland Security, this is in 2001, I was the recipient of obviously drank from a fire hose. There were a lot of briefings, and one of the briefings included the pathogens that we should be concerned about, that if they fell in the hands of the terrorists, we might have to deal with. Now, this is 2001, early 2002, and one of those pathogens was Ebola. You draw your own conclusions. If we thought it was serious enough then, in 01 and 02, whether as a country we had the infrastructure to identify and respond as quickly as we did in 2014 and 2015. So there's been an awareness out there for quite some time. Think about 2003, the SARS. Began in China, zoonotic, based in a zoonotic episode. Took a while for the global community to become aware of it because it took a while for the authorities in China to let the World Health Organization know. Avian influenza returned to our poultry facilities in the Midwest again this year. And now we have the news about the Zika virus. Again, I think congratulations, and it's admirable that the administration has recognized the need, understands there'll be resources that are absolutely essential to deal with it. But if you listen to, hopefully you listen to some of our recommendations, and I'll let Senator Lieberman conclude, and then we can do the Q&A. Once again, it is reflective. It is reflexive. And one of the purposes of the panel, one of the purposes of the commission is to build an infrastructure internally, both from a scientific and technical point of view and a medical infrastructure point of view, so that when these things happen, you may need emergency appropriations, but you don't have to scramble multiple agencies, multiple political appointees in order to bring specific focus on a potential pathogen. I don't think we should forget as well the ever-present danger from pandemic influenza, the rise of antibiotic-resistant organisms like drug-resistant tuberculosis, and let's not forget about the spread of disease syndromes like SARS and MERS. Meanwhile, the terrorist threat simmers quietly, but just as insidiously than ever before. The aspect of the bio threat, the combination of intent and capability to use biological weapons, it's pretty difficult to quantify. I think we all understand and agree on that. It's an enormous challenge to collect intelligence on the development of bioweapons. How does our country, or any country for that matter, know whether someone working with pathogens in a laboratory is working for the benefit of that community and the world, or to its detriment? The dual-use problem is hard enough to tackle here in the United States labs, no less than labs and makeshift facilities in foreign countries. Now, here are some of the open-source facts about this threat, of which you may be aware, but it bears repeating. We know that al-Qaeda sought to develop biological weapons. They launched a program in Afghanistan to develop anthrax into a mass casualty weapon. The U.S. discovered evidence of that unsuccessful, or maybe just not fully realized, program after our military entered. We know that ISIL has publicly espoused the value of biological weapons for their ability to cause massive loss of life, and they have certainly expressed their intent to use such weapons. We know, according to the intelligence community and the Department of State, that China, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and Syria all continue to engage in suspicious dual-use or biological weapons, specific activities, and that we believe are in violation of the Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention. We know that caches of incompletely destroyed or buried biological weapons materials from old state programs can now be accessed again and then smuggled to other regions for use in today's wars by proxies, which include some of today's terrorists. And we know that ISIL now possesses what it needs to get a biological weapons program going: a large enough piece of land that can be both controlled and secured, physical infrastructure like labs and manufacturing facilities, scientific expertise, professional military personnel who would know how best to deploy these weapons. So we believed, as part of the panel's discussion and recommendation, we need to do a better job of getting the intelligence community the resources it needs to address the biological threats properly. Frankly, our assessment of the nature of the threat believes that the limited resources are far disproportionate in a negative way with regard to the emphasis we need to pay attention and have the IC community pay attention to biological threats. Now, let me be very clear about something. Even with intelligence on nefarious intent, it takes, obviously, a very sufficient leap, perhaps, to go from intent to launching a successful attack. A significant amount of knowledge and the institution of some sort of program are necessary for the successful development and execution of a mass casualty attack with a biological weapon. These are fairly large hurdles to jump over and may explain why we have not seen a large-scale biological attack yet. But our study panel, and frankly many of the experts who spoke with us and gave us some guidance, actually, are concerned that as biological science becomes democratized and increasingly ubiquitous, these hurdles become lower, and frankly, they're going to be a lot easier to jump. Still, our weaknesses in the biointelligence prevent us from having situational awareness of both our enemy's intent and their capabilities. We intend to work with Congress on the upcoming Intelligence Authorization Bill to realize the kinds of improvements the nation needs in supporting IC. Finally, we're also expressed a concern reflected in the testimony of many groups and individuals that appeared before us, involving the interface between the digital world and the digital threat and the biological threat. Experts told us that the United States is not yet well positioned to address cyber threats that affect the biology and biotechnology sector. We do not know how a cyber attack would affect the life sciences, and we're not sure how well pathogens' data are secured. Our panel recommended that the U.S. government, in partnership clearly with the private sector, move quickly and innovatively to address this growing cybersecurity threat in this sector. We need a national strategy and must be prepared to commit the resources to it for stored pathogen data. And we need to ensure that we provide the research community with standards and incentives and support to secure their data as well. Although we came up with about 33 recommendations and about 100 very specific action items to help formalize the biodefense enterprise in this country and to make it function more efficiently and effectively, where was one major, may have been at the proposal at the epicenter of our aspirations in terms of building a national strategy in response to the potential threat. Let me just say this as an outset. We identified over 50 political appointees who are given some important but narrow responsibility in the whole area of biodefense. And you can well imagine the number of agencies that have as part of their jurisdictional responsibility biodefense. So you have multiplicity of people and agencies. Perhaps you can understand our most basic recommendation. Our foremost proposal was that the Vice President of the United States should be the focal point for coordinating the many responsibilities inherent in running the loose conglomeration of activities and people we call within our government the biodefense enterprise. We need someone at the top who can get the multiple departments, there are a dozen plus departments and agencies working together, moving simultaneously in the same direction so that we can make progress. For us, in many instances, it was a matter of leadership, organization, and implementation. All things we Americans were pretty good at all these things. Once we bring a focus to it, put somebody in charge to hold others accountable for the mission, to executing on the mission and the strategy that we proposed. We also made several other recommendations to support the Vice President, including bringing members of both the government and the private sector to actually build out a strategy upon which these recommendations would be implemented and execute that strategy, again, in building the infrastructure we think we need to identify the threat, build the infrastructure internally to respond and recover if, we don't want to be breathless about it, but in the event that either a terrorist or Mother Nature throws a contagion at us, particularly one that we're not well prepared for, if prepared at all. I think my friend and colleague, Senator Lieber, and I will be very pleased to take your questions once he's had the opportunity to share his thoughts with you as well. Thank you very much.
Senator Lieberman served 24 years U.S. Senate, but among his many, I think over 100 awards and decorations was a Navigator Award from the Potomac Institute, which recognized his leadership in policy and law derived from science, technology, and rationalism. He is the epitome of what people say doesn't exist in Washington anymore: comedy, working across the aisle, and getting things done. It's a real privilege to have him here today, and it's a privilege to have him working on one of the hardest problems, I think, facing the country. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Lieberman.
Thanks, Mike, and ladies and gentlemen. I actually, of all the awards I have, that Navigator Award I got from Potomac is one I still have, because it's a beautiful piece of woodwork, and it has a clock in it. The only thing I got worried about, and you were kind enough to repeat the word, is one of the adjectives you used to describe me was rational. And that probably explains why, after I got the word, I got in political trouble back at home. It's a dangerous thing to be rational. Thank you all. Thanks to you, Mike, and a particular thanks to Yonah Alexander for the support that the Potomac Institute gave our bipartisan Blue Ribbon panel on bio threats to the U.S. We couldn't have done it without you. This experience, and General Gray, thank you too, General Khalidi, Dr. Carwell, and most of all my friend and co-chair, Secretary and Governor Tom Ridge. My work on this panel proves that there actually is life after the U.S. Senate. It can be constructive life. And working with Tom Ridge, I proved that it can be more bipartisan than most anything happening on Capitol Hill today. So a great pleasure to work with Tom. I just want to add a few points to what Governor Ridge said. He covered it. I mean, this was about America's state of preparedness to detect, prevent, and respond to a bio threat, whether it be from terrorists or from nature. And it's hard to look at the current state of terrorism in the world, particularly with the coming of the Islamic State, which seems to have built its credibility and, in a sense, of popularity in a small radical group, because it went beyond the standards of brutality of even al-Qaeda that preceded it, particularly with the beheadings, that they're not working now, as we knew al-Qaeda was, to develop biological weapons to use against us. The world presents every day, including this day, with the announcement President Obama has made about responding to the Zika virus, the increasing threat of a naturally occurring pathogenic bio threat to the U.S. and to people all over the world. And I just want to talk about a few of the conclusions. This is a program about international cooperation, most particularly about international cooperation in dealing with terrorism. But I do want to seize the moment, as the governor did, and talk about international cooperation with regard to naturally occurring bio threats. One of the things that I had known some about before from my work on Homeland Security, but really learned a lot more about on the panel, and also learned a new word, which I'm embarrassed to say I didn't know before: zoonotic. Zoonotic means diseases that reach human beings through animals. We learned a lot about that subject, and particularly about what I would call the generally prevalent and totally artificial separation between humans, animals, and the environment when it comes to biological threats. In fact, among the biological threats for which the U.S. Department of Homeland Security has issued a material threat determination, all of them, except smallpox, are zoonotic. The same is true of emerging infectious diseases, 60% of which enter the human population via animals. I saw an article a while ago that started with a question: what is the animal or non-human being that has the deadliest effect on the human race? And you can make a lot of guesses. Maybe today, because of Zika, you've guessed what it is. It's the mosquito. This study that I saw said the mosquito can be blamed for 750,000 deaths a year around the globe. Tom Ridge talked about avian influenza. It devastated parts of the poultry industry in our own Midwest, Northwest, and California last year. More than 48 million birds had to be culled and euthanized. That doubled the price of eggs, cost taxpayers nearly $1 billion, and reminded us that there were no vaccines or treatment available to prevent the spread of the disease or treat the poultry that had it. But what is actually as alarming is how these diseases spread. Avian influenza began in Asia and was carried by migratory waterfowl, who then, in various ways, enabled to spread to poultry. How it got to the United States or to North America and South America are fascinating questions. Some of the theories are, believe it or not, that the migratory birds meet in the Arctic and sometimes the Antarctic, and then blend and spread the disease and bring it back to where they are. This cries out for international cooperation, because while it's true that individual countries can limit the spread of disease by applying public health standards in their immigration policies, that is to at least temporarily, perhaps permanently, stop people from coming in who show signs of the disease, ultimately that's not going to work. I mean, ultimately, no matter what your overall immigration policy is, or if you put up a big wall to stop immigrants from coming in, it's not going to stop the waterfowl or the mosquitoes who are carrying the disease. And that really calls on us all to figure out how to cooperate to cut the incidence of these diseases. I saw a statement by an expert in this a while ago that predicted that sometime in the next 2 or 3 decades there would, in fact, unless we manage to come up with better prevention devices, approaches, and better major medical countermeasures, that at some point there would be an infectious disease pandemic. It would make as many as 1 billion people sick, would kill millions of people, and would cost the world over $1 trillion, maybe trillions of dollars. So we need international cooperation to work to prevent that, of course, from ever happening. Now, let me just focus quickly, and then we'll go to questions, on 2 international organizations that the U.S. and a lot of the countries represented here are part of. One is the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, the so-called BWC, which has presented a lot of challenge to all of its signatories. Given the dual-use nature of much of the work done in the life sciences, it is difficult to verify that countries are not doing that work in support of an active biological weapons program, as opposed to more benign and constructive activities, including dealing with the threats that I've just described of naturally occurring infectious diseases. You've got to recognize, as our panel did, the difficulties inherent in establishing effective verification protocols. And America's representatives to the BWC have expressed that clearly. But just because verification is hard does not mean that we can, in any sense, disengage from this international process. We've got to keep trying to establish a verification protocol that makes sense and enables all nations of the world to differentiate between legitimate work and that used or being used to develop biological weapons. And that, from our point of view, means that the United States must stay at the table, engaged with the rest of the world to make progress on this problem. The second organization is obviously the World Health Organization, which has worked hard to maintain awareness of what I'd call global disease pathogenic surveillance. In other words, which diseases are where, and to alert the world when serious diseases appear and spread. But WHO does not have the resources or capabilities to do it all. We've got a responsibility, our panel concluded, to lend our resources and expertise in the global disease surveillance endeavor. I understand the United States has, I know the U.S. has contributed in the past, for instance, sending CDC personnel to work at WHO headquarters in Geneva, donating funds to the Global Outbreak Alert and Response Network, and sharing a lot of the information that we get from our own disease surveillance efforts. And I also know that the Obama administration, fortunately, has placed a high priority on global health security. We've got to maintain and increase those efforts in our own self-interest and self-defense, let alone to protect the rest of the world. Governor Ridge talked about the 33 recommendations, 100 action items of our report. We don't have time to even begin to describe those, but it's online, and I urge you to go to that panel. I do want to say, on a day when President Obama, and I thank him, President Obama, for announcing the $1.8 billion to take preventive and responsive action to the Zika virus, on a day when he's announced that the finding of our panel was that the federal government is simply not coordinating the enormous number of efforts in this area of detection and response to biothreats. And therefore, I would while I'm grateful for the statement the President has made, I'm also concerned about whether this money will be used in a well-coordinated and most cost-effective way for our government. And that's why, as Tom said, we recommended something unusual, which is that the Office of the Vice President be put in charge of this, to give it the power and clout of the White House, and also to be able to coordinate what's going on. Bottom line, bioterrorism, naturally occurring infectious diseases are a clear and present danger in our time that is growing. And we concluded that our response to that threat is not growing as fast. We need to pick up the pace, and to go to the topic of today, we will do it best if the nations of the world are working together to meet this challenge, which is to all of our citizens. Thank you very, very much.
Yes. Some questions for Governor Ridge and Senator Lieberman?
Yes, so there's been incredible progress, of course, in understanding the nature of diseases. There's been incredible progress in the ability to analyze massive quantities of data that will be necessary in order to detect early naturally occurring diseases, as well as people trying to create bad things. And this type of data would include things like social media data, it would include HIPAA-protected data, it includes financial transactions of all sorts. And so where there has not been any significant progress, as far as I could tell, is in gaining access to that kind of data. So my question to you is, have you guys done anything or looked at anything to provide access to that kind of data to the researchers and the practitioners who actually need to use it?
Let me try to respond because I think it's a very, very, very germane question. First of all, there is disparate data all over the United States with regard to zoonotic diseases, but unlike personal health and requirements, there's not a national registry of animal health diseases. So you might want to start with the basics. We don't even have basic information to give to you with regard to a reporting requirement either from Department of Agriculture, Department of Interior, and the like. So one of our recommendations, clearly, if you're looking to build a One Health concept that's people, animals, and environment, you better accumulate the data, number one. So one, we have to meet that responsibility in the United States as well. Secondly, engaging the broader global community to share with us timely and relevant information to the WTO or whatever the mechanism is. And it's just not our responsibility. We have to be re-engaged in the global community in order to develop both access and credibility that we are interested in being a leader in this space. And we've kind of pulled back from that over the past several years. I'm just not incriminating anybody. We have to be more engaged if we want to gather that data. And then finally, we've made very specific recommendations that obviously, the intelligence community is focused on the kinetic threat. It's focused on the digital threat. Don't spend a lot of time or resources, have too many people using whatever capabilities we have to determine both intent and capability of other countries, nation states out there, as well as terrorist organizations to see where they are in the development of a bio-threat. So your question is germane. It's the heart of several of the basic recommendations we made to Congress.
So what about the legal and policy problems? Well, even if the data, you knew where it was, you still can't look at it. I mean, it's enormous.
You mean because it's classified or?
No.
No.
Well, so it could be HIPAA protected.
Uh-huh.
It could be just ordinary social media data, which the United States government is not allowed to look at on a large scale. And it could be financial transactions of all sorts, purchases of different types, movements of different kinds of materials. You know, we know where the data is. We know how to get it. We're simply not allowed access to it because of legal and policy problems, and that's preventing us from doing anything really useful.
You know, I must say that we didn't really directly focus on that. I mean, what is, and it's a good question. If you have any answers to it, you should. Well, I'd welcome that response. I would say this is part of the lack of coordination of the whole counter biological threat apparatus in our government. I'll give you an example. It's not directly on point, but it'll tell you what the problem is. We estimated, or we found estimates that the federal government is spending $5 to $6 billion a year on to counter the biological threat of the two kinds we've talked about. But we didn't get that from the federal government. We got it from a university group. I think it was University of Pittsburgh. Because the federal government has no unified budget in this area. That's one of the things we've asked the vice president to do if we can get him authorized to do it. So I got to tell you, and I build on everything that Governor Rich said, that maybe this is one. It's not easy because, as you know, some information it's hard to share, but it's in everybody's interest to make as much of this available as possible. Now that if you've left DARPA, now you can go on social media and get the stuff that you. That's pretty ridiculous, isn't it? I mean,
Well, it is ridiculous. I mean, for example, I was at a meeting at AFSEA and the INSA, you know, the Intelligence Community Organization,
Yeah.
and I was on a panel about open source intelligence. And I made the observation, I said, well, you know, ISIS, the Russians, the Chinese, everybody in the world has complete access to public U.S. social media data except the United States government. What's wrong with that picture?
A lot.
And it goes on and on to medical stuff. And
Okay, good point.
Hi, I'm Colin Agee with the United States Army, and we haven't forgotten that Governor Ridge is one of our veterans from Vietnam. I didn't realize till I read your bio that you did that in the middle of law school and then went back and finished. That's a little unusual. The question I have, though, is about asking if you looked at the genetic aspects of bioterrorism and the prospect that some nefarious actor could manipulate a disease such that our existing vaccines and treatments were ineffective?
Well, it's a real danger, but you know, the nature manipulates the threat regularly. I mean, we don't know that by the end of the avian flu outbreak last year that killed or forced people to kill almost 50 million birds in the U.S., chickens mostly, a vaccine was developed. But the experts told us we don't have any confidence that that's going to be adequate to meet the next avian influenza outbreak. And this is not simple, but we've got to figure out a way to coordinate our efforts better. Now, we seem to be somewhat lucky in the sense that some of the work that was done on previous viruses may help us at least expedite the medical countermeasures to the Zika virus. But no, what you're saying is a real threat. And if nature can do it, people can do it too.
Yeah, one of the major deficiencies that we believe exist within the multiple pieces of this infrastructure, and the Senator and I are very aware of Washington's a silo-based operation, number one, and first thing you need to do is connect the silos. That's easier said than done. Other times you need to even build new capabilities in addition to the ones you have, is that there is no permanent infrastructure to take research capability immediately to focus on a pathogen that suddenly appears, not necessarily in the United States, but elsewhere. Mother Nature can change the genetics. I mean, we've seen that with the pandemic. It was H1N1, then there was a modification of that, then a modification of that. So Mother Nature does it all the time. And with the democratization of science and more information out there about how you can, since so many of these diseases are zoonotic in application at a point of origin, the notion that somehow we will be fairly risk-free because nobody's going to get access to that information, and not saying that they secure it by a digital breach, which they could very well do, and we're very concerned about the pathogen data in some of the universities to make sure that they've raised their level of cybersecurity as high as possible. We don't have an infrastructure. We have no capability internally to devote resources and intellectual capital to finding an antidote, finding a countermeasure. And again, one of the recommendations we make, and we suspect that even if we could get the Vice President to accept that responsibility, build out a strategy, that would be a substantial infrastructure improvement, because right now it's transactional, it's ad hoc. I thank the President, $1.8 billion. Where's it going? Who's going to coordinate it? And they'll be responding to the threat rather than having a permanent infrastructure that says, okay, we haven't seen it before, but there's enough information out there. How do we identify the countermeasure? And do we have a surge manufacturing capability to deal with it? We don't have that. We're going to need that in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add, we spent a fair amount of time on this, which is there have been efforts, BARDA and other programs that have been established that have aimed at creating public-private partnerships, particularly with the pharmaceutical industry, but with the academic community too, to give us the capacity to quickly respond, or ideally to be ready before there's an outbreak with a vaccine or a treatment. And some good work has been done under BARDA, but you know, I worry. I know that the naturally occurring infectious diseases they're ahead of us. We're not ahead of them. And of course, I worry that the terrorists are as well. It's not easy to draw the incredible capability of for instance, the private pharmaceutical industry into this without incentives and subsidies, because there's not a given market for a vaccine they develop, because we all hope and pray that an outbreak doesn't occur. So we got to find better ways. We made some recommendations in our report about how to do that. The ideal is that we'd be ready, in a sense, on the shelf, when one of the naturally occurring diseases or, God forbid, a terrorist attack occurred, to be able to respond and stop it and treat people.
One more.
Hi. Hi, my name's Ron Taylor, and for Senator Ridge, I had the honor of working with you in the early days when you were in the White House and when you became Secretary of Homeland Security, so that was my honor there. For Senator Lieberman, I always enjoyed our collaboration because I worked in science and technology at DHS. I enjoyed our collaboration, the collaboration with your staff, and I got to understand your rationale totally through the many questions that came my way, either formally, informally, written, unwritten. So, wow, what a thrill to get to ask you a question.
Thank you.
So anyhow.
To the senator. Go ahead, Senator.
Yeah, it's his question. It's his question. So
usually when this happened,
you got the applied Senator.
Yeah, usually when this happened on the Senate floor, one of the colleagues would say, my colleague from Connecticut, really one of the finest people I've served with, and I so admire his position on many issues. But on this issue,
I tried to do it without the but.
No, go ahead.
But anyway, the question really is for both of you, and you both have touched on it. I've gone on. I work now internationally. I'm with George Washington University Cyber and Homeland Security, a senior fellow there, and so I stay in the business and I stay alert to the problems that you all have discussed. For me, the issue is about safety, security, and prosperity, ensuring that for the nation. I was once a director of a study that was called Making the Nation Safer, the role of science and technology in countering terrorism. And so I very much appreciate, Senator Lieberman, the comments about the science space, because a lot of the solutions and a lot of the problems are mixed up together in what scientists do. And so we have to keep track of that, and they have to participate. But really the question I have, and I think that the solution is, what is the role of the private sector? You can throw academic in there if you want, but it really is the private sector. And I've heard you talk about the strategy with the government, and I've heard you talk about incentives. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, because I think the strategy with the government maybe is too slow. The threats are too fast across not just bio, but other, particularly when you mix in information technology with bio. And so, how do we get the private sector to stand up for any responsibility it has in sharing some of this information that it owns that can be of use? When we need information, we go to the private sector often, and we get it from people, as opposed to from the government.
Let me start, and I see Tom maybe come up with a specific section. We're lacking in this. We're living in an age of miraculous progress in so many areas of human life, based on information technology. The advance in the biological sciences has been extraordinary. Look, we're all living longer on the average as a result of what pharmaceutical industry and medicine are able to do to help us. But we're not adequately harnessing the what's out there for this public purpose. Now, part of it is a lot of the companies that are doing some of the extraordinary work are profit-making companies. They're accountable to their shareholders. They're likely to invest more money, obviously, in something that has a mass market than something that is going to be on the shelf for a disease, an outbreak, a pandemic that has not yet occurred. So we looked at different, BARDA has tried some incentives. We looked at different incentives. One of them that we looked at is, for instance, would give them essentially not exactly a free pass, but a quick pass through the FDA in a case where they're dealing with a current threat and they have a response to it. We haven't reached the depths of how to do this yet, but we have proven our capability as not only a society but a global society to do things that were thought to be impossible not so long ago. So do I think we can come up with medical countermeasures that can both prevent through vaccinations and treat both biological terrorist attack and naturally occurring infectious disease? I do, but we haven't organized ourselves to make that happen yet. Gov, you want to add anything?
Yeah, we just, and again, you take a look, we'll get you a copy of the report. There are 4 or 5 elements to it. We want BARDA to take the contracting authority to go back to BARDA. We think that'll expedite it. We understand in our that we have to do more with the funding, hospital preparedness. That's going to be an integral part of the response and recovery system. We speak broadly about incentives to the private sector. It's pretty difficult to convince any company and anybody in pharma to take on massive expenditures on their own for a potential market. We want them to build medical countermeasures. And frankly, we took a look at some of the existing medical countermeasures. We know we have surge capacity for that. Some of that money should be shifted into innovation. Some of it should be shifted over to the private sector to be a little bit more innovative than rather just cranking out additional countermeasures. So I think there are very specific recommendations. We want to streamline the process of contracting. We want to create, with the collaboration of the farmers, talk to them about the kind of incentives they need to make collaborative investments with the federal government. And you know who's going to have to pay for the medical countermeasures if we're going to pre-position them around the country? Taxpayers. Because it's not like you're going to go to your doctor who's going to write a prescription for a medical countermeasure in the events of an emergency. So that's all focused in the report, and we think, particularly if we have someone like the Vice President making those very specific recommendations, we'd like to think at the end of the day, find bipartisan support for encouraging the private sector, because we don't have the capability to build countermeasures in the federal government. We better figure out a way to incentivize the private sector to do it.
Yes.
Thank you very much for both your presentation and for answering the questions. As was noted earlier, the Blue Ribbon Panel on Bioterrorism will continue on for the next year. The progress is being made, but there's quite a bit more left to do. Hopefully, the co-chairman will come back next year and give us an update, and hopefully much more will be done by then. With that, we need to turn to our international partners, a couple of whom have joined us today. Our effort has been noted by our distinguished panelists. Terrorism and all the aspects of terrorism are a human and international problem, not a domestic problem per se. It's a problem for all of us. The International Center for Terrorism Studies, led by Professor Yonah Alexander, has been partnered with international academics and organizations and governments for quite some time, and it has been our annual tradition to have some of our partners here to discuss their views and their actions on terrorism over this past year. I'd like to now turn the forum over to Professor Alexander, who will introduce our 2 distinguished speakers today from Jordan and from Sri Lanka. Professor?
Thank you very much, Mike. As you indicated, clearly the work of the academic community cannot be conducted without international cooperation. Fortunately, for decades, we had the opportunity to work with international organizations like the United Nations, the European Union, and specific countries, as you mentioned. I'd like specifically to recall the many contributions in this particular field in terms of identifying who are the terrorists, what are the root causes, what is the outlook for modus operandi, both on the conventional, the unconventional level. And finally, what kind of strategies can be developed? I would like to recognize and acknowledge specifically the role of NATO and the NATO centers of excellence, for example, in Turkey, in Ankara, and the Partnership for Peace, as well as specific countries such as Jordan. And again, the contribution of Jordan are well known in terms of advancing the cause of peace and stability in the Middle East, the peace treaty with Israel, for example, and also the role of King Abdullah, who after 9/11, we should not forget that he mentioned that what these people, those perpetrators of 9/11, stand for are completely against the wishes, the thinking, the principles of the Arabs and the Muslim countries. So with this introduction, I would like to invite our next speaker. You have his bio right here in terms of his academic role. It's a very long list of academic achievements in the field of technology, for example, mechanical engineering. He was educated in the United States and the UK, and Major General Engineer, I would say Dr. Omar Al-Halidi, will make some presentation and answer a few questions.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. I would like to say a few words before I begin my presentation. I'm very, very honored. I'm honestly very, very honored to be speaking in such a distinguished organization, as well as alongside with this distinguished panel. I would like to thank the audience for bearing with me for the next 15 minutes, 10, 15 minutes. I think I was told 10 minutes, but if I carry on, please stop me. Our area in the Middle East, we all know that it's always been driven by culture and religion. This is the history of our area, the home of the three great religions, plus, of course, civilizations that have existed for thousands of years. And those religions, they've always complemented each other. Judaism, Christianity, and then Islam. We started along like that. And whatever that came out from that area, it has always been the product of either that culture or the integration of these three religions. In the so many centuries ago, anything that happened in that area that was related to those religions, it's always been a fact, a very well-known fact, that people has actually used that. But the fact is that these religions, they complement each other. They say the same thing. And they talk about the same values, exactly the same values. None of these religions, they will say, go and kill somebody. None of them. Not Islam, not Judaism, not Christianity. In fact, in the last maybe 100 years, 70 to 100 years, it was elaborated more and more on religion that has become a norm that, whatever that I do, oh, it's because I'm a Muslim, or it's because I'm so-and-so. So I think that in the last maybe 30 or 40 years, we have discovered that certain groups from all over the world, not just from our area, from all over the world, they've used Islam to dwell on, oh, there is a Khalifa, there is jihad, there is this, there is that. When we know very, very well, because we're Muslims, like His Majesty King Abdullah said a few weeks ago when he said that when I grew up in a community where whenever we see each other, we say Assalamu alaikum. Like the Jewish people, like the English, the Muslims, we always start with Assalamu alaikum, which is exactly the same in both religions, which means that, first of all, before you start, before you see anybody, you wish them peace. These organizations, they forgot that, and they've used Islam in order to become or to gain certain achievements, and most of it was, of course, against Islam. In the last 20 years, Qaeda, they've used that. And we knew that Al-Qaeda were a terrorist organization, purely terrorist organization. People started to know that through the way that they finance themselves, the way that they got themselves or had resources drawn from certain things. Lots of people in our area, they knew that it was against Islam. And then Al-Qaeda, more or less, as they started become, or as they started to surface, the people started to know that it is absolutely nothing to do with religion. Now, if I talk, the last thing that I would like to talk about Daesh, I would like to quote Her Excellency Theresa May when she said, ISIS, Iraq and Syria, Islamic State, or Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, it's not Islam, it's not Islamic, and it's not a state, which is true. End of quote. It is true that it isn't a state and it isn't Islamic at all. If we talk about Daesh, what I would like here, I don't want to repeat what General Stewart, thank him, of course, for his keynote speech. I wouldn't like to repeat what he said, but what I would like to compliment. Daesh have always managed to grow two things and think of two things and elaborate on two things: the physical entity of Daesh and the ideology. The physical entity, which we know from Jordan and from our intelligence, with the help, of course, of the DIA and other organizations, that they have always had support from somewhere. They cannot exist on just what they have. They must have logistics, and I did my PhD in logistics, by the way. They must have had very, very, very powerful and strong and very, very deep logistics support from somewhere. And the problem is that they still do. So that is something to do with their physicality, with whatever that they are doing at the moment. The most important issue for us, whether it is here in the United States or in our area, is the ideology that they are using, the ideology that they are implementing in order to radicalize people. The guy in California, I cannot imagine that such a person with nice records, nice wife, nice home, nice job, and he does something like that. When the bombings in London in 2005, I was there, I was stationed actually in the embassy of Jordan in London. The guys, the four people that, the perpetrators actually, or the criminals, or whatever that we want to call them, we can call them anything. These guys, they were very nice people, very good people. So the problem is that how do we go from here? How do we look at ideology and look at it from the point of view where, how can we counter that ideology? Communication is very, very, very well open for everybody. Social media is very open for everybody. The transportation now, I mean, in Europe, you can get into your car from Glasgow or from Edinburgh, and you end up in Berlin or whatever, and with nobody asking you where are you going or where are you coming from. So communication, as well as transportation, social media, and the vulnerability of the Muslims that we, in our area, thinking that, you know, oh, they are jihadis, they are this, they are that. There is no such thing. We all started to realize that these guys, they are actually implementing their policies and their strategies on how vulnerable we are when it comes to ideology. The last thing that I would like to say is that in Jordan, we've suffered so many conflicts in our area. Well, the problem is that we had no interest in any of these conflicts. If I talk about now, if I talk about development, social development, economical development, scientific development, anything, any kind of development, we've always talked about, we've always studied, whether here in the States or in America or wherever, you always have short-term and long-term plans. In Jordan, we've never been able to have a long-term plan development. I'll tell you why. In 1916, there was a conflict. In 1926, there was another conflict. 1936, 46, 56, 67, 73, 91, 2003, 2011. Each and every 10 years period, we've always had to come up against something that was actually thrown at us. Now we have 1.5 million Syrians. Everybody talks about Syrians. We have 1.5 million Syrians. That is about twice, and according to my records, it could be as much as 3 times as Europe had in the last maybe 3 or 4 years. But we have Iraqis, we have Egyptians, we have Yemenis, we have Libyans. We started in 1948 as about 2.5 million people. 1967, we became 5 million or 6 million. Now we are about 10 million people. Education, healthcare, economy, everything, housing. When I wanted to buy my apartment in 1982, it was about 21,000 JDs, which is about $25,000. My son, last year, he bought his apartment for $130,000. Sorry, JDs, about $200,000. And all of that was implemented in the Jordanian. King Abdullah last week, he said in London that 25% of our budget goes to refugees. 25%. Imagine that. That is a lot. I would like to finish with saying that we've had a wonderful relationship, a magnificent relationship with both the government of the United States as well as the people of the United States, and we're still having a wonderful, let's say, period where we're working with each other, we're trying to implement peace over there. We have a wonderful relationship with our neighbors, an excellent relationship with our neighbors, and hopefully in the very near future, we would like to think that, that region will have peaceful time where our children and grandchildren live in peace like they live here in the States and like they live in Europe. Thank you very much. Any questions, please?
How would you say the U.S. could help Jordan become an even more effective partner in the war against terrorism? What could the U.S. do that it is not doing to help Jordan be more effective? If you have a wish list.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. First of all, as a soldier, I would like to think that, the United States has done its share towards Jordan tremendously. In the last 50 years, we've done a lot together, and we've always experienced that help and that support from the United States. But to answer your question, we know that terrorism is a common enemy. Funny enough, if I count now, you'll be amazed of the Syrians, the Russians, the Saudis, the Iranians, the Americans, the Jordanians, the Israelis. Everybody think that Daesh is bad. But how much are we doing to try to get rid of Daesh? This is something that we've always talked to our neighbors, talked to the people that have always supported us. The United States in particular, what we would like the United States to do now is to be and to stand as they've stood before against tyrants, against dictators, And hopefully, Jordan will benefit from that. Because, we in Jordan, we've always thought that peace is the only way for social development and economical development, and eventually providing goodness for our children and our grandchildren and our generations to come.
Thank you very much, Major Hadidi. My name is Ambassador Salah Sarhan. I'm presenting Arab League in Washington, and I'm very pleased to be here today as I'm a newcomer. Major, I'm very aware of what you are saying, and everything is clear to me, and thank you for clarification. But to say the role of Arab League in Cairo and Washington, I would like just to answer the question of my colleague just answered you about what is the role of the United States to combat the terrorism. I think the international coalition is very well known. Most of Arab countries are joining the Arab coalition, the international coalition against Daesh and the other type of terrorism. So we are all agreed that this group of Daesh or Qaeda or whatever has nothing to do with Islam, and they are very extremist, and there are very barbarian and barbaric attacks are affecting us as a Muslim. Thank you very much, Major Hadi.
Sir, I thank you very much for that. But when I see something like that, this is very, very nice. Each and every single word that was written in here is chosen very, very carefully and very, very nicely. But the first thing that you see there, Islamic, and we drive ourselves as Muslims, Christians, Jewish, from such an organization. This organization was collected from criminals. We know that. Everybody knows that. They were originally criminal, but very clever criminals. They used social media. They used lots of knowledge about communication, and they started to enroll people into their schemes. But they're absolutely nothing to do with Islam. You are right, 100%. Yes, sir.
Your candor, and I think most Americans that pay attention to the relationship we've had with Jordan appreciate
Thank you, sir.
the strength of that relationship. And there's so much discussion about the impact of refugees on Europe. I'm glad you brought it up. It's even a disproportionate impact to one of our strongest allies in the region, and that's Jordan. And until somebody understands or deals with the instability in Syria and elsewhere that has generated the refugee problem, we're still going to be dealing with the consequences of instability. And that's for a separate discussion. I am very curious as to the kind of support, financial support, you're getting from other countries in the region, the kind of support you're getting from the United Nations. The disproportionate burden of refugees, in my judgment, because of the failure of the global community to deal with the crisis in Syria and the genocide that's going on in Syria, has fallen on the government and the people of Jordan. Would you lay out for everybody here what the rest of the world is doing to support your efforts? The instability in Syria has nothing to do with Jordan. You didn't cause it. The rest of the world's ignored it. What's the world doing to help you?
Yeah. Sir, I would really, really like to very, very much thank you for such a statement. I'm not a politician, I'm a soldier, and normally, I speak from my knowledge as a soldier, and, to talk about politics and things like that, we don't, I don't. So it's very, very valid point that Jordan is paying a lot. You're listening to His Majesty, you're listening to me, you're listening to lots of people who come here and talk, or who go to Europe and talk. But there are millions of people who are actually affected by this crisis, in refugees as well as in security. At the moment, Jordan is, with the help of our allies, especially the United States. I would like to thank each and every single state that have actually contributed towards our stability, which is now very, very vital. It's very, very important. But the problem is that we are crying out loud that Jordan cannot withstand that pressure anymore. Jordan is crying for help. It's not just a matter of 300 or 400 million that is going towards ammunition and going toward F-15s or F-16s or something like that. What we would like is that we would like the people of Jordan that have actually expressed themselves when the Syrians started to come in. And I was on duty and I knew exactly how people felt. Lots of people, they have actually accommodated them into their homes. They did not wait to ask for help from the government or from the United Nations. What we would like to see is that our allies from everywhere, not just from the United States. The United States, like I said earlier on, I've been a soldier for about 36 years, and all the time we've always experienced that magnificent support from the United States. The problem is that we would like the Arab League, it's very, very important, the Gulf countries, as well as Europe, to do more. More, not just for the war machine, but as well as for the people of Jordan to try to support that conflict, which is, it's coming out of its proportion, it's getting out and becoming bigger than the government of Jordan. Thank you, sir, very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, General, for your insights, very rich, I think, issues that you raised, and the challenge to Jordan now on the humanitarian level as well as security. Just as a little footnote, I want to mention, I think the definition of bankruptcy that we're struggling with academically as well as policymakers for many decades. One of them, as I mentioned, the definitional aspect that you raised about the so-called Islamic State. And I think, again, it is really fundamental to say that we cannot attribute terrorism and violence to any particular country, any particular region, any particular religion. No question about this. And I fully agree with you that we do have a common ground of Islam and Judaism and Christianity. If we save one life, it seems as if we save the entire world. Salam alaikum. At any rate, the point I'm making is that I think we have to focus on what the so-called Islamic State is, and I fully agree it's not Islamic, it's not a state, but they attribute, at least the so-called, they declared the caliphate, and certainly the Muslim world have to provide some guidance how to deal with that dilemma. But at any rate, this is an issue for some other, I think, seminars or discussions in the future. Now, let me move on to our last panelist today. I think it is rather very significant to talk about a different kind of support and combating terrorism for many decades and the experience of Sri Lanka. With great sadness, I would like to report to you that a former foreign minister of Sri Lanka, Kadir Gamar, who spoke at our seminars right here at the Potomac and elsewhere, he was assassinated by the extremists, although he was a Tamil himself, and he sacrificed himself on the altar of peace. And we see, of course, we know other leaders as well. For example, Yitzhak Rabin in Israel by Jewish extremists and terrorists. So we know the story, but as far as Sri Lanka goes, I think it is important to have some historical perspective, as well as some analysis from someone who spent decades as an historian to deal with identity crisis, for example, security and peace issues. The Deputy Chief of Mission of the Embassy of Sri Lanka, Dr. Yamini Kiribela, is uniquely qualified, I think, to deal with these issues. He was educated both in Sri Lanka and Canada. He was teaching for many, many decades. And he has the role of both a diplomat, an historian, and an academic. And I asked him actually to share with us some of his insights related to the history, modus operandi, for example, as well as how to end insurgency and waves of terrorism in his country. Perhaps this would be a lesson for some other nations to follow. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor Alexander. First, may I crave your indulgence to say that it is a great privilege and honor for me to be here. I'm particularly thankful to Professor Alexander for giving me the opportunity to share this podium with a panel of distinguished scholars. At the outset, I must state that I am here not as DCM of the Sri Lankan Embassy, but as a scholar who has studied ethno-political conflicts for years. The diplomatic mantle that I am wearing is very new. I am more comfortable in the academic cloak that I have been wearing for nearly 4 decades. As a historian, I can't agree more that retrospect is the key to chart the future prospects. From this perspective, reviewing Sri Lankan experience with terrorism is highly relevant to the discussion today. The LTT carried out an armed struggle for nearly 30 years. It was long considered the most ferocious and well-organized terrorist group in the world, with a sizable suicide squad of its own, in addition to having a naval arm, and in the last phase, a rudimentary air arm as well. Finally, the Sri Lankan forces were able to militarily defeat the LTT in May 2009. After 7 years, we should be able to review terrorism and counter-terrorism in Sri Lanka in order to draw lessons to avoid the recurrence of these types of episodes. What are the political and strategic messages that the military defeat of LTT sent to the world? Can the collapse of LTT be explained in terms of military strategic factors alone? These are the issues I intend to address. First, I intend to analyze the political anatomy of the LTT. Then I will address the factors and conditions that contributed to the outcome of the armed conflict. Finally, I will dwell on key lessons. Primarily, LTT was a terrorist organization. Nihilistic type of well-planned assassinations remain a key tool and hallmark of LTT political behavior. The political driving force of the LTT was Tamil nationalism. Its every move was justified in terms of Tamil national aspirations. Hence, without reading the politics of the LTT, it is not possible to analyze its character. Ultimate objective of the use of terror was to achieve a separate state for the Tamil people in Sri Lanka. In order to understand this militant phase of Tamil nationalism that the LTT represented, it is necessary to project it in the trajectories of Sinhala and Tamil nationalism since independence. There was a symbiotic relationship between Tamil and Sinhala nationalism in post-independent Sri Lanka. Furthermore, the structural crisis of the post-colonial state in Sri Lanka and the reaction of the state to suppress Tamil dissident bestowed certain degree of legitimacy to their struggle at the beginning. Another key feature of the organization was the personality cult. It was a tightly knit organization, and any dissenting view within the organization was severely suppressed. In the behavior of the LTT, military strategy always took precedence over the political strategy. Totalistic perception of ultra-Tamil nationalism of the LTT prevented it from having a political dialogue with the reformist forces in the South. At the same time, the LTT maintained a widespread international network. Military defeat of LTT has been analyzed from different perspectives. A number of factors were identified with military strategic factors given primacy. In that, the role of the political and military leadership of Sri Lankan forces, effective military strategy of the Sri Lankan forces and their dedication, and the newly acquired firepower, rift within the LTT, impact of the democratic changes in the North, and the change international context after 9/11 were given attention. I'm not discounting the validity of these factors. My argument is that defeat of LTT cannot be adequately explained only in terms of military strategic factors. Collapse of the LTT shows the limits of terrorism as a political tool. Its organization was fraught with a number of flaws. LTT was able to mobilize a suicidal squad and highly dedicated cadres. However, it suffered from a number of organizational and conceptual weaknesses and limitations. Command structure of the LTT was excessively authoritarian. There was no room for internal discussion. As a result, LTT did not adjust strategically or conceptually to the changes that were taking place in national and international politics. The authoritarian character and the leadership cult deprived it of the means of feeling the true pulse of the people living under its control. In the final days of war, LTT planned a human shield, but once the Sri Lankan forces broke the siege, people deserted them. LTT failed to present broader democratic agenda to restructure the Sri Lankan state. Even when a separate sovereign state for Tamils in Sri Lanka became more and more impracticable in the light of global socio-political trends, LTT did not want to change its political objective and its military strategy to settle for a political solution less than that of a separate state. The suppression, ruthless suppression of the other Tamil voices in the Tamil society by the LTT watered down moral justification of their struggle. Terrorist face of the LTT, rather than that of the liberation fighters, was illustrated more and more by the nihilistic type of assassination of individuals. The structural political crisis of the post-colonial state in Sri Lanka and the failure to address grievances of Tamils bestowed some credentials to LTT at the beginning. However, authoritarian character of the organization couples with terrorism and a failure to compromise on any political solution other than a separate state pave the way for its doom. Hence, both the emergence and the collapse of the LTT highlighted the thirst of the people in the North for democracy, justice, human rights, good governance, rule of law, and accountability. Therefore, main lesson that can be derived from military defeat of LTT is the need to bring democratic political reforms to the forefront of the political agenda. Thank you.
We have time for one or two questions. One question.
Yeah, questions. Not
okay,
speeches.
questions. So let me ask you a question in terms of the role of diaspora, in terms of propaganda by the deed, indeed by propaganda, in terms of support of extremism and violence in Sri Lanka.
Yes. When we talk diaspora, it is diverse. Normally, we have mainly two kinds of diaspora, Sinhala diaspora and Tamil diaspora. You know, even Tamil diaspora, there are various shades. Therefore, on the one hand, LTT wanted to maintain, and LTT maintained, very widespread international network using the experiences these Tamil people faced in Sri Lanka during the ethnic riots in order to weave the network to procure arms as well as pressurize governments. But with the passage of time, LTT, the Tamil diaspora also became much more divided, and there were many forces, because in Sri Lanka, in north area, there was no democratic political space. But in here, with the passage of time, democratic political space emerged within the diaspora. There were a number of waves. The second thing is Sinhala diaspora. Sinhala diaspora also view the Tamil, the extremism is their other. Therefore, they wanted to counter. Both the extremism, in order to find a solution, we have to defeat both extremisms of both Sinhala diaspora as well as Tamil diaspora.
Okay, thank you very much.
General Bragg?
Any questions, General Bragg? No. That's all yours.
I guess that's it, then.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
As usual, I'm invited to say something when the program's already over and late. Thank you. But I do want to thank our distinguished panelists for joining us today. Governor Rich and all, Senator Lieberman, it's always a privilege to have you aboard and to listen to your sage advice on where we're at. And we really got a good update in this bio study on the future and where we're headed. So we're on the right track there. General, yes. Thank you, too. And let me just say, from a personal standpoint, I want to thank you and your country for all that you quietly did during the Iraqi conflict and the like. Your knowledge and experience in the region, your understanding of the Sunni tribes, your understanding of matters of economics in and around Baghdad saved a lot of American lives. Thank you, so thank you. And Dr. Kirilla. Thank you. Dr. Kirilla, for you, some people don't know just how many years you have and how diverse your capabilities are with respect to studying for peace and bringing peace and working to that end, not just in our great country and the like, but you're well known in Japan, you're well known in Australia, you're well known in India, and of course you're well known here. And thank you for joining us as well. Yonah, enough's been said about how great you are and all that. But thank you all for joining us and the like. And remember, there is hope. I'm the eternal optimist, and therefore you're going to have to suffer with me here. We're gonna be successful in all these endeavors because we're building the right kind of teamwork. We're building the right kind of partnerships around the world. We're doing the right kind of things in many places, and we understand that it's not just a military thing. Far from it. It's an economic challenge. It's a political challenge. A societal challenge. A technology challenge. And again, we've got to make sure that the people who are right now supporting this crazy ISIS and the rest, these people need to understand that ISIS and what they stand for is going to get beaten. And once you beat them, the people are going to leave them. Believe me, that's the way it happened with the former Soviet Union, and that's the way it's going to happen in the future. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.